And then she's doing the washing up. I don't think I can cope with this. The credit came one side. He couldn't lift her on his own.
Oh, my goodness.
So the Queen came the other side. I don't think this featured in The Crown.
A very unlikely friendship with a pigeon racer in Norfolk.
The way to the Queen's heart, basically, was to talk about dogs, horses, or it turns out, racing pigeons. But I discovered that in Sandringham, which is one of the estates where the Queen lived, nearby, she discovered there was a guy who was a collector of racing pigeons, had a wonderful collection of racing pigeons, and she became a friend of his and would go and spend, apparently, an hour or two in his loft discussing racing pigeons with him. It is amazing. But it was the pigeons that was a shared love. The Queen was so pleased when I said to her, I can't stand the way my children leave the lights on. She said, oh. She said, do you? I said, they do. She said, well, you know, I used to go around Buckingham Palace trying to turn off the lights. She said, but Buckingham Palace had a lot of lights and I couldn't always find where the switches were. And sometimes people who met them as real people found it very difficult. David Cameron, Prime Minister. The Prime Minister always would go up to Scotland, spend a weekend with the Queen during the summer break. And they would go for a picnic. And the Queen and Prince Philip would serve them. Prince Philip would do the barbecue, and the Queen would serve people. And David Cameron, British Prime Minister, for a number of years, just couldn't get his head around this. This is the Queen. This is Queen Victoria's great. You know, this is the descendant of Elizabeth, and she's bringing me the sausage and mash. I don't know, you know. And then she's doing the washing up. I don't think I can cope with this. But for the Queen, it was normal, and of course, it was a life of service. And indeed, one day, after he'd been Prime Minister for a few years, he thought, well, actually, I'm here, I'll help out with the washing. I'll do it like I do it at home. So he got up and began putting on the gloves to do the washing up. And the Queen said, what on earth does the Prime Minister think he's doing? Back in your place. We are the hosts here.
I love that.
She had a nursemaid who looked after her called Bobo MacDonald, who went everywhere with her, and rather alarmed the Duke of Edinburgh, because when he turned up on their honeymoon, Bobo came too. He went into the bathroom, and there was the Queen getting ready to have a bath, and sitting on the edge of the bath was Bobo.
This is the start of a worrying rumour, Gyles.
And testing the temperature. And you thought, what is this woman doing in here? Somebody went up to Balmoral and said, oh, you can get there, you can talk to the Duke of Edinburgh about anything. But the Queen is more limited in her conversation. As you've got dogs and horses, you only talk about international affairs. And she followed international affairs. There's a famous story of, I think it was Gordon Brown, another of our Prime Ministers, going for his weekly audience and arriving. And the Queen said, oh, it's such a shame about the Prime Minister of wherever it was. And he said, what? What do you mean? And it was the Prime Minister of a Commonwealth country who had just resigned, and the Queen knew about it before the Prime Minister did.
Uh-oh.
She was really on the ball, on the money that. And you know, she very rarely expressed preferences for anything. I happen to know what her favourite musical was, because I teased it out of her. She would have been furious if I'd published that during her lifetime. But she made one exception. People often asked her, who is the most remarkable person you've met? Because she met everybody, from Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra to President Putin and Idi Amin. Yeah. She had met the whole spectrum. But if you did say to her, who is the most remarkable person you have met, you could get her to say somebody, and it was always Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
Because she was just so moved by the way he had emerged from 27 years in prison without rancour. And the Queen could do the most wonderful impressions, and not just of people, but she could do a very good impression of Concorde, the aeroplane, landing over Windsor Castle.
Excuse me?
The aeroplane landing over the... why did they build Windsor Castle?
Have you actually
so
witnessed the Queen doing an impression of
Concorde landing? It was very noisy. And a friend of mine...
I mean, that's a Britain's Got Talent sort of sketch.
She was that gifted. Well, if you saw her with Paddington Bear, you know what a gifted performer she was. I think she was happy because she was driven by duty. She was sustained by faith. That was the most important thing to her in life. She once said to me, out of the blue, we were in church at the time, and I mentioned something about the Lord's Prayer, Our Father which art in heaven. And she said, sometimes the Lord's Prayer is all you need. And that mattered to her. Faith mattered to her. I discovered that there always photographs, or there used to be a film of her on a Sunday morning going to church. What we didn't know was that that was the second time she went to church. She'd already been privately earlier in the day. So her faith mattered to her. It's often said that when she met her husband-to-be, who was a Prince Philip of Greece in the 1930s, he was about 18 and she was 13, and they famously met at Dartmouth Naval College. And it's often said, indeed it was said in many of the obituaries for her and for her husband, that that's when they first met. It wasn't. Mm-hmm. They were cousins. They were both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. And they'd known one another as children. They will certainly have met before. And it's said that she only ever had eyes for him. Well, as I discovered and I revealed, she had eyes for other people as well. In fact, I'm able to quote some letters and some diaries of the time where it's clear there were one or two other rather good-looking young men that she thought could possibly be even husband material. There was a matter of policy with her. I went to a show with them once, and it was something called the Royal Variety Show. It's to raise money for charity. And if he didn't like an act, he'd be muttering about it, looking at his thing, saying, "Oh, God, not Elton John again." But the Queen was very even. And I noticed during the show, he'd be applauding if he really enjoyed it, and just sitting there. If he didn't enjoy it, he just, checking his watch. But the Queen consistently applauded the same amount of time, almost to the second, for every act. When the interval came, I said, "Well, Your Majesty, you seem to enjoy everything." She said, "Well, I did." He said, "You seem to enjoy everything equally." "Did you, Your Majesty?" "Well, perhaps not." She said, "But I said you applauded, or just the same." She said, "Well, yes, you see, we're on television, and their families might have been watching, and I didn't want..." Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the protocols with the Queen is you're not supposed to initiate the conversation. They've got to lead the conversation. Her real passions in life, what she liked talking about, were dogs and horses. I know very little about dogs and horses. So, but she was quite relaxed, so I would often initiate the conversation. And sometimes one would talk about children or grandchildren. What I noticed was that when she talked about her children or grandchildren, she never picked out anybody. She always used to go in descending order. So she talked about the oldest first, then the next oldest, and similarly with the grandchildren. So that it was seemed to be in her DNA to be totally fair. I know to be true because the only other person in the room who's still alive told me the story. Margaret Thatcher, one of our longest-serving British Prime Ministers, our first woman Prime Minister.
Indeed.
When you become the Prime Minister in this country, you go every week when Parliament is sitting to have a meeting with the King or Queen, to unburden yourself and to keep them up to speed. And the first time Mrs. Thatcher had become Prime Minister, she went to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. And it is traditional to bow, if you're a man, or curtsy if you're a woman, in front of the sovereign. And the equerry, taking Mrs. Thatcher to meet the Queen for the first time, said, "Prime Minister, have you got your curtsy ready?" And she said, "Oh, yes, I'm completely ready with that." And they went into the room, and the equerry said, "Your Majesty, the Prime Minister, Your Majesty." He then backed out of the room, or was about to. And as he was backing out, he saw Mrs. Thatcher curtsy. She curtsied right to the ground, beautiful curtsy, and stayed there. She couldn't get up.
Oh, wow.
She had curtsied so low, so deeply, that she was stuck on the floor. And
she's very lucky that gravity didn't go the full...
I think she was it was like that. The equerry came to one side.
Strong thighs, Mrs. Thatcher.
The equerry came one side, he couldn't lift her on his own.
Oh, my goodness.
So the Queen came the other side. I don't think this featured in The Crown. Somebody like President Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. And I quote in the book this wonderful correspondence. This is after President Eisenhower had been on a visit and had stayed, I think, with the Queen up in Balmoral at her Scottish home. And she saw him on television in a news item, and she remembered, "Oh, goodness, I promised the President my recipe for drop scones. He particularly liked my recipe, and Mamie didn't seem to have made them." So she wrote in her big loopy handwriting, "Dear Mr. President, hope all is well with you and the children and the grandchildren. I've just remembered I didn't send you that recipe." Now, and then she wrote out the recipe. At one of these Privy Council meetings, these are all the ministers, the Queen was there presiding, and somebody's mobile phone, their cell phone, went off. One of the minister's cell phones went off, and the minister was terribly embarrassed. And the Queen said, "Oh, you better answer that." And I said, "I'm so sorry." She said, "You better answer it. It could be somebody important." And that was the Queen speaking. There was a fine film made with Helen Mirren playing the part of the Queen. And I said, "Have you seen this? It's a very popular film." To the Duke of Edinburgh. He said, "Of course I've seen it." He said, "But I understand they have the Queen crying." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, the Queen doesn't cry."
Never?
No, he said, "That doesn't make her..." You see, it's interesting. It doesn't make her unfeeling. He immediately knew that's what you'd say. "Oh, never, never." Of course, she may well have cried, I don't know. But she was not given to crying. That wasn't her style. Doesn't mean to say you're unfeeling. He said, but the press always want to see her crying. Show us how you feel. So, for example, they wanted to illustrate that she was more felt more about the Royal Yacht Britannia than about her own children. And so there were pictures taken when this boat, this lovely ship that she did love, and she went on many tours with, and it used to go on summer holidays on it, where every summer holiday she showed a James Bond film. She was very keen on James Bond's film. She told,
oh, it's all coming together now.
And she said, until they came so loud.
Yeah.
Anyway, she complained the noise of the films was too loud. And she said, on television it's all very loud, but I can't understand what they're saying. That's by the by. There were pictures taken which appeared to show her crying. And he said, of course, give them what they want. They think she was crying. She said, we were all crying. The wind was terrible. It was a very cold day. Really, that sort of thing infuriated them. She, I think, just took it in her stride.
Thanks for watching. On Thursdays, don't forget to tune into Palace Confidential, your weekly look at all things royal.